Hello, friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. Today we have 5 great stories for you to enjoy. Subscribe to our channel if you're new here, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Sit comfortably. Here we go. I froze my psycho neighbor out of her apartment. In college, my 2 friends and I decided to find a place together off campus. We found a beautiful 3-bedroom house with surprisingly affordable rent. The basement of the house was listed as a separate apartment, but as it had a separate entrance and the indoor stairwell had been blocked off, we weren't worried as the thermostat was upstairs. Then the demon neighbor moved in. From upstairs, we could hear everything. This adult woman would call her mother and scream at her to pay for her cell phone bills and give her grocery money, aka Taco Bell and cheap tequila. She would scream at a guy to bring her cigarettes, and one day she brought home 3 puppies to scream at too. We were terrified of this woman, and the noise was hell. Also, we'd been idiotic enough to sign a lease stating we were responsible for all utilities, period, meaning we were now financing her gas, water, and electric. But with only 2 months left on the lease, we thought we could just ride it out. But then she started smoking. Constantly. According to the landlord, she'd quit for good when she signed the lease, but for good only lasted 2 days. Since it was winter, the heat was running nearly 24/7, and the smoke was wafting up from the vents. Our apartment and all our belongings began to reek with smoke. We contacted the landlord because we'd signed for a bloody non-smoking apartment. He told us we lived in a state where you could technically call an apartment non-smoking, even if it shared ventilation with a smoking apartment. F you, leasing laws. At this point, my 2 roommates were heading out for a 2-week vacation. They were online students while I was residential, leaving me alone in the apartment with the demon smoker in the basement. I couldn't sleep or eat because my idiotic stomach decided to react to all the secondhand smoke by aching and cramping constantly. After 3 days, I was a little insane. I made a plan. I checked the forecast, low 20s all week. I borrowed a friend's ultra-insulated sleeping bag. I bought one of those ski masks with the holes for your eyes and mouth. I got out my stocking cap, my silk long underwear, my woolen socks, and my down parka. I bought tea, hot cocoa, and ramen, and prepared to live off a diet of hot liquids. And then I turned off the effing heat. Day 1, she's screaming at her mother for forcing her to move into this frozen crap hole of an apartment. Day 2, she's screaming at her boyfriend because he won't let her move in with him. Day 3, she's screaming at the landlord about how she's effing freezing. Day 4, the landlord is at my door. I greet him in full ski mask, parka, stocking cap array, looking like I'm headed out to rob Santa Claus at the North Pole. He asks me if I don't find it a little chilly in the house. I reply, I'd found all the cigarette smoke a little warm. Day 5. She's screaming about the B words upstairs to anyone who will listen, and I'm sitting upstairs clutching my car keys and my pepper spray with 911 typed into my phone. She finally decides she's effing leaving and moving in with Greg. Day 6. She's gone. I silently bless Greg. Moral of the story, there's a bloody reason the rent seems too good to be true. P.S. For those wondering, I did have a friend who worked plumbing stop by to give me some advice on how low I could go before I burst the water pipes to hell and back. And our next story. Don't mess with professors of mathematics. This is a story my grandfather told me before he died a few years ago. My dad had been telling prank stories from university, but none could top this one, it turned out. It starts out slow, so bear with it. In the 1960s, my granddad was a professor of math at a fairly prestigious university. At the time, the council of that city had been putting an awful lot of pressure on the university to buy back student accommodation so that it could be repurposed for council housing. Whilst the council had technically done everything legally, enough financial pressure had been put on the university that it had to back down, and it put a lot of pressure on them accommodation-wise the following year. Anyways, the executive officer of the university happened to be a former math professor and a friend of my granddad. At the time, the council was planning a new one-way system in the city, which they were going to install on a Sunday to be ready the Monday morning. The devious math professors somehow got a hold of the plans for the system and worked out, using network analysis or something, can't remember what Granddad said exactly, that reversing the direction of two of the new one-way streets would cause all of the traffic to spiral into the center of the city and not be able to get out again. And it crossed their minds that this might provide them with some small feeling of justice for the pressure the council had put on them before. So they went out on a Sunday night, I'm told with nothing but a crowbar, after all the signs had been installed, and turned the signs on the aforementioned streets around. Total chaos the next morning. Granddad compared it with that scene in Turin from the Italian Job. The newspapers had an absolute field day shaming the council. It took 2 days for the police to work out which signs had been changed. Remember, it was only a couple of streets out of probably 100 or so, by which time I suspect the economy of the city had suffered just a little. And they never found out who'd done it either. And our next story. How to shut a party down for good. So my dad is an old amateur radio guy, ham operator, and when I was about 13 or 14, my family was living in a crappy duplex while our new house was being built. We had decent neighbors on the other half of the duplex, but every time they went away for the weekend, often, their 18 to 20-year-old son would host these huge parties and did not give two Fs about noise complaints. We would call the cops, they would come, turn it down, but the music would get turned up right away when they left. One night it was getting especially out of hand and the cops never came to deal with it. Late into the night, my dad gets up, pulls an old radio out of his storage closet. All his gear was packed up since he didn't have the room for it or his 60-foot antenna tower in this little crap-hole duplex. He pulls about 20 feet of unshielded wire off a roll and starts running it out the back of his radio, along the wall, up about 5 feet, back down again, across the wall some more, up again, and back down. He knew where the tower speakers were located on the other side of the wall from having coffee with the neighbors. He keys up the mic, and we could hear the click come through the wall. He then shouts, "Turn that crap down!" into the mic, and it came back through the wall, louder than I could hear his voice while standing next to him, and about half of "down" is replaced with a loud whomp noise followed by silence. Cooked the amplifier for their stereo, skipped right past any protection circuits inside it. My dad had an ear-to-ear grin before we had a D-bag son pounding on our door. My dad opened the door, and this kid starts throwing punches immediately, called the cops again, now with an assault report, and suddenly they show up in minutes. My dad didn't press charges, but the cops made him apologize, and when his parents got home, they'd made their son pay for the stereo. That was the last party he ever had. And our next story. Try to squeeze my dad for his money? Tough luck. He knows money. The background. Back during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Malaysia was hit pretty hard, especially the small independent banks. The Prime Minister at the time passed a bill to save the banking economy by having all the larger corporate banks buy out the smaller independent banks. At the same time, he made the One Malaysia Home Loan Policy. Under this, all larger banks that bought out the smaller independent banks must send an acknowledgement letter to the home loaners of the original banks stating the home loan change and must receive an acknowledgement from the new loaners, be it a signature, physical, or digital. The story. My dad never liked how banks can legally rob people. For people like him who work the daily grind, having to pay the bank what is essentially 2 houses worth in interest payments over 2 or 3 decades is just plain wrong in his eyes. He strives to one day screw a bank over like how they screw their customers. A contract. Be it sheer dumb luck, or is God listening to his prayers and decided to grant him that opportunity? That was what he got. When my dad bought our family's first home, he got a loan from a small bank called DCB Bank. All is well until a few years later. The 1997 financial crisis hit. As the small banks were bought out by the larger banks, many homeowners received acknowledgement papers on their new home loan payment plan and policies by their new banks. My dad, for whatever reason, never received this. He only knew that his original bank was bought over by RHB Bank Corporation and that he is now unofficially their customer. My dad was frugal with his money and, God bless him, financially literate. He knew that if he made a full settlement against his principal loan, he could avoid paying 30 years' worth of interest installments. Sometime in 2007, he went to a RHB Bank branch nearby to make a full settlement, and this is how it went down. RHB employee, I'm sorry, sir. Even if you make a full settlement, you would still need to continue making payments for the interest. Dad: what do you mean? I have a home loan contract under DCB that states I can make a full settlement without paying for additional interest. RHB employer: true, but since you've acknowledged and signed under RHB... Dad: I've never received the acknowledgement papers. I never signed any papers from your bank. And all I have here is the DCB bank contract. RHB employer: sir, under the One Malaysia home loan... Dad: you have to send acknowledgement letters about the loan transfer. Yes, I know. What I want now is for you, RHB Bank, to produce my signature of me acknowledging the new loan policy for RHB. As of now, my paper with DCB is still valid until you produce my signature. Cue 1 hour of the employer and her colleagues scrambling around their files and databases, trying to find any acknowledgement from my dad about their loan contract. At this time, the manager of the bank had called my dad into his office to discuss the problem. It basically had went from civil to a shouting match that can be heard in the neighboring food stalls. My dad couldn't remember most of what was said, but the end of it was what he could still clearly remember. And to his son, it was probably one hell of a badass conversation ender. Manager: I'm sorry, Mr. Muhammad, but you still need to make the interest payments regardless of whether you make a full payment. Dad: all right, I understand. I'll just have to take this up to Bank Negara, National Bank of Malaysia. Let them help you find that signature of mine. My dad had the bank manager by the balls now. Rather than risking a potential $1 million lawsuit and possibly losing his job, he excused himself to make a few phone calls to upper management, which took about half an hour. After said phone calls were done, the manager approached my dad and agreed to the full settlement without the additional interest installments. To add salt to the wound, my dad requested that they have his housing grant ready within the week, to which they delivered. All in all, my dad managed to secure himself a house, the housing grant, and in the process, screwed RHB Bank of what is equal to $60,000 worth of interest payments, which to a middle-class Malaysian in 2007 is a retirement fund. And our last short story. They tore up my grandfather's garden, he tore up their car. My dad told me this story a few years back. My grandfather lived in a really rural area in Georgia. This was around the late 1930s, early 1940s. My grandfather owned a farm and had a garden. He'd planted various veggies. Well, the only neighbors were about a mile away, and for some reason, the neighbors would drive their Model T through the garden, tearing up the veggies. My grandpa would have to replant the garden. The neighbors kept doing this. So here comes the revenge part. My grandfather dug holes around the garden and stuck metal poles into the holes. He covered up the holes with leaves. A few days later, the neighbors drove through again. My dad said they tore the undercarriage out and had parts strewn all over the place. He couldn't remember what happened after that, but I don't think they did that again. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.